Our most popular video explained how Perth overtook Brisbane in growth. But here is the part that confuses everyone. Even after all that growth, Perth is still cheaper than Brisbane. How can a city be the fastest growing market in the country and still be one of the most affordable capitals? Today we explain the real reason, and why that gap is closing faster than anyone expected. Let's start with the raw comparison. The median house price in Brisbane now sits comfortably above $900,000. In Perth, despite a year of surging growth, the median is still meaningfully lower. So even though Perth has been climbing faster than Brisbane, it started from so far behind that it still has not caught up. To understand why, we have to go back 10 years. For almost a decade, from around 2014 to 2020, Perth was the worst performing capital city in Australia. The mining investment boom that had driven the Western Australian economy wound down. Construction collapsed. Builders went bankrupt. Tradespeople left the state in large numbers. Property prices fell, then stagnated for years. While Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane were rising through that period, Perth went nowhere. By the time the long downturn ended, Perth property was extraordinarily cheap relative to the rest of the country. It had effectively missed an entire growth cycle. That decade of underperformance is the key to everything happening now. When demand finally returned to Perth, the city was completely unprepared to supply it. Remember, the construction industry had been gutted. There were not enough builders, not enough tradespeople, and not enough new homes being created. So when buyers came back, they found very little to buy. That is the textbook recipe for rapid price growth. Strong demand smashing into severely restricted supply. Prices had nowhere to go but up, and up fast. Three forces are driving the current Perth boom. The first is that supply shortage, which cannot be fixed quickly because rebuilding a construction workforce takes years. The second is migration. After years of people leaving Western Australia for the eastern states, the flow reversed. Strong mining wages, genuine affordability, and lifestyle have been pulling people back to Perth. The third is the resources sector itself. Iron ore prices have stayed high enough for long enough to fund strong wages, government infrastructure spending, and business investment across the state. So why is Perth still cheaper than Brisbane despite all of this? Simply because the gap was so enormous to begin with. Brisbane spent the early 2020s as the darling of the Australian property market, with prices in some suburbs nearly doubling, driven by interstate migration and the excitement around the future Olympic Games. Perth, meanwhile, was still climbing out of its decade-long hole. Even a year of explosive Perth growth has only started to narrow a gap that took 10 years to create. Let's talk about where the opportunity sits within Perth. At the affordable end, the southern and outer suburbs have led the percentage gains, as buyers chase anything under $600,000. In the middle ring, suburbs close to the city and the river have surged on the back of infrastructure spending and lifestyle appeal. At the premium end, the riverside and coastal suburbs have hit record prices. The growth is broad, which suggests genuine strength rather than a narrow speculative bubble. But here is the crucial warning, and it is the same warning that applies to every resources-linked market. Perth lives and dies with the price of iron ore. Roughly speaking, a huge share of the Western Australian economy depends, directly or indirectly, on the resources sector. When commodity prices are strong, Perth booms. When they weaken, Perth can stall or fall, sometimes for years, exactly as it did during that long downturn. Any investor buying into Perth today needs to understand that they are, to some degree, taking a position on the future of iron ore demand. That is not a reason to avoid Perth, but it is a reason to buy with eyes open and a long time horizon. So what is the smart approach? 3 principles. First, recognize that the easiest, fastest gains in this Perth cycle have probably already happened. The early movers caught the steepest part of the climb. That does not mean there is no growth left, but it does mean expectations should be realistic. Second, focus on established suburbs with genuine long-term appeal rather than chasing brand new estates on the distant fringe, which carry the most oversupply risk when the cycle eventually turns. Third, watch the warning signs. When you see building approvals running hot for a sustained period, migration slowing, and iron ore prices softening all at once, that is the signal the cycle may be maturing. Perth is still cheaper than Brisbane because it spent a decade falling behind, and even a powerful boom takes time to close a gap that large. The window where Perth offered deep value is narrowing, but the story of why it got there is one of the clearest examples of supply and demand you will ever see in Australian property. If you found this useful, hit subscribe, because we break down a different Australian market every few days. See you in the next one. It is worth pausing on what this means for buyers in the rest of the country who are watching Perth from afar. The Perth story is a live demonstration of a principle that applies everywhere. Markets are cyclical, and the market that has been the worst performer for a decade can become the best performer almost overnight when the conditions reverse. The investors who did best in Perth were not the ones who bought at the peak of the previous boom. They were the contrarians who bought during the long, depressing downturn, when nobody wanted Perth property and the headlines were uniformly negative. By the time a boom is obvious and exciting, the easy money has already been made. The lesson for every market is to be most interested when others are least interested.